first hot Parma chat post-COVID, so brilliant to get back to get going again. But we do have some learnings, is that we've actually got it on Zoom, going to record it. God willing, and the sun still shines, I'm going to be able to actually post it so those folks who couldn't make it on a Friday night can see it. So why not take some of the Friday night learnings that we had in COVID and move it forward? So we're going to carry on. So leading it off this year's session, I guess really, Charles Meredith, you all know, past Commodore, with also a professional capability to talk about Port Phillip, and I was corrected on my post, it's not Port Phillip Bay, it's Port Phillip.
Well done!
I was corrected. No, not me, the person who corrected me. And then when she said, Bert told me, I said, Uncle. So, further ado, please pass over to Charles. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Yeah, interestingly, it is Port Phillip and Western Port, which is two words, and we all spell it as one word and call it Western Port Bay. But anyway, why am I talking about this? I've got a background in ecology, and I'm not talking about ecology tonight. I'm talking about the landform, the geomorphology, as they call it. So I worked in the environmental area, and I worked with some really smart people that studied this sort of stuff, and I kind of thought, I found it very interesting, and I hope you do too, to see, you know, what you're sailing over, what's formed it, what lies beneath you. To me, it adds a lot to a cruise. So there we are. We've got a picture of Port Phillip, which I'll concentrate on, and Western Port Bay. You can immediately see Port Phillip's a pretty unusual bay. It's very large. It's, if I can read that, it's about 1,300 square kilometres. And it's got a tiny, tiny entrance down here at the rip. I can find the... No, I can't find that, it don't matter.
You know where it is.
You know where it is. And that makes it a lagoon. And in fact, I've been told it's the largest lagoon in the world, because a lagoon is an enclosed area of ocean that has a very small entrance. I don't know if it is, but it's certainly a very big one. So it's quite unique in that regard to have a bay that's shallow, that large, with a tiny entrance. And then just down the road you've got Western Port, which is a much more classic sort of bay in some ways, in that it's got a normal, wide, deep entrance and so on, but it's got two islands in the middle of it. It's totally different, and yet they're right next to each other. Now I want you to, I'll get into, sorry?
Just to interrupt you briefly, like that, the shading of Western Port, is that indicative of its shallowness compared to Port Phillip?
No, I think that's a Google Earth artifact, unfortunately. So yeah, that's not actually, I saw that too, and I thought that's great, but then they do something funny until we zoom in with their colours in the scene. But a couple of things, I'll come back to these later, but a couple of things to look at. If you look at Port Phillip, on the Mornington side, it's a fairly straight edge, fairly parallel to the edges of Western Port Bay. And similarly down on the Queenscliff side, that smaller section between Queenscliff and Port Arlington, St Leonard's area, is quite straight too, and then you've got the Corio Bay hanging off to the side. Now, in nature you don't get a lot of straight lines. If you see two things in nature, a circle or a straight line, it tells you something unusual is going on, because normally it either looks fairly chaotic and random, or it's usually a curve that's not a nice neat circle, like a parabolic curve. So that's going to tell us something which we'll come back to later. So yeah, Port Phillip Bay, oh sorry I was wrong, almost 2,000 square kilometres, 333 kilometres of coastline, and very diverse, 1,000 species of marine plants and animals. Western Port Bay is almost exactly the third the size, 656 kilometres squared, got two big islands in it. Now if we go back to Port Phillip, this is the bathymetry of Port Phillip. It's a little hard to see, but basically it's a contour map of Port Phillip at the top, and there's a cross section at the bottom. Don't worry about the bottom yet, we'll get to that. But what you can see is that the darker the shading it is, the deeper it is in the bathymetric map at the top. So Port Phillip falls to the south, so it's shallow near where we are and the Yarra, and the deeper areas are down to the south until you get to the shoals at the before the rip, you know, around between Queenscliff and Sorrento, those areas, or the Great Sands as they're called, where it gets very shallow. And then you look across the Corio Bay and that's shallow again and gently sloping back towards the deeper part of Port Phillip. The bottom one is a little hard to see in some ways, but it's a cross section, and it's a cross section from north to south of Port Phillip on an imaginary line that might be the old course of the Yarra, if you like it. And so at this end, it's Port Melbourne, and you can see the whole bay gradually slopes down, gradually gets deeper as you get towards the Great Sands, and then in this particular section it doesn't show the Great Sands, but it shows what's called aeolianite, which literally means wind rock. It's the sandstones that make up Point Nepean, all that area, and both sides of the rip. So they form a rocky barrier at the end of the bay that the rip cuts through. And there's our rip. Pretty impressive piece of underwater geography, and it cuts through as a deep canyon. It's 60 metres roughly deep in an area where the general depth of Port Phillip is about 15 metres on average once you get out towards the flatter parts. But this just cuts right down very steeply and has that big right angle bend in it that heads off to the east. Again, we'll come back to what's going on there in a while, but that's sort of the shape of Port Phillip Bay. So what's underneath the water? Now, what this shows is the substrates or the sediments underneath the water. Essentially what you can see is anything that's sort of yellowish or brownish is sand, anything that's bluish or greyish is mud. And so what's going on, you've got your sandy beaches down the eastern side, you've got the Great Sands at the bottom where it's all very, very sandy with that yellow and green. You've got the deeper area in the middle where the silt is collecting that's coming out of the Yarra mainly, and so that's more silty. And then the darker grey area to the north of it, which is again a bit silty, but there's not as much silt, more sand. And then you go off on the other side to Corio Bay, and while there is some sand there, particularly around the Werribee River outlet, it's actually very muddy, and there's a reason for that we'll come to. So you're getting the idea of these patterns. You've got a bay that slopes down gradually in a single direction. You've got Corio Bay's a bit different. There's a lot of sand on one side, there's a bit of mud on the other. As opposed to Western Port, which has got a lot of mud at the top. The drying areas in the green on the chart are all mud, and most of the substrate in Western Port in those deeper channels is mud until you get basically to the big main Western Channel where you've got a sand substrate. Now, interestingly, if you imagine Port Phillip Bay, this massive area with this tiny entrance, the average what they call residence time for water in Port Phillip Bay is 400 days. If you're a bad yachty and you chuck your unwanted diesel over the side of your boat just out here, it's going to be there for more than a year. It's not literally there, but that water is not going to get flushed out the Bass Strait for 400 days on average. Whereas in Western Port, which has this big, wide, deep entrance on the western side and a deep, although much narrower entrance on the eastern side, the flushing time around the eastern entrance is 1 to 2 days, and even right up at the top in the northeast area, we've got those shallows and so on, it's around 90 days. So it's a totally different environment. And if you sail on Port Phillip Bay, you know that up here you hardly bother about the tides. They're about 1 metre. They get more important as you go down, particularly around the Great Sands and the channels there and close to the Rip where you get very strong tidal currents. If you're sailing in Western Port, everything is about the tides. I remember the first race I did in Western Port. It was quite a light wind race. We were doing great on the first leg. It was fantastic. We were way out ahead of the fleet. The closer we got into the mark, which was close to the land, the more the wind dropped down. And I looked back and I said to the crew, everyone's catching us. And they said, no, they're not. We're going backwards towards them. Now, being a good Port Phillip Bay racer, I had my anchor nicely tucked away. They all had their anchors ready and they were out. They were anchored and we were going back through the fleet. So, Western Port, very different environment in lots of ways. So why is Port Phillip Bay shaped like it is? Now, it's actually a really useful diagram, but from a very old paper, so it looks a bit old-fashioned, but it's quite useful. You can see Port Phillip Bay, you can see the Otway coast, and right down here you can see King Island. Those two dotted lines are fault lines. Fault lines are where two sections of geology meet and they slip against each other. The one on the eastern side is the Selwyn Fault. That's the major fault in Melbourne. There are actually quite a lot of earthquakes in Melbourne. Most people in this room will have felt an earthquake in Melbourne sometime in their life, but they nearly all come from the Selwyn Fault, which goes up through the eastern suburbs, almost exactly along the eastern coast of the bay, the straight line. I'm telling you, straight lines are unusual in nature. If you see a straight line, it's nearly always a fault. Through Cape Schanck. The reason the topography at Cape Schanck has a sudden change is that's the Selwyn Fault, and then it keeps going to King Island. On the other side is the Bellarine Fault, which sets the other side of the bay, and you can see that doesn't cover the whole bay. You've got a section to the west, which is Corio Bay. So let's ignore Corio Bay for a minute, but that section in the middle between the two faults is what's called a graben. It's a rift valley. You've got two faults and all the land in between them is dropping down. The reason Port Phillip Bay is where it is not because a river has cut a big valley, otherwise it would be narrow. It is because all that land out there is gradually dropping down between these faults. And on the other side it's a bit more complex on the west side, so you get the sloping of Corio Bay coming into that. On the east side the fault is a very strong and major fault, so it's a pretty straight line. And interestingly, and again we'll come back to this later, those fault lines and that graben, that Rift Valley, go right under Bass Strait. Now, Rift Valley's obviously this one in Africa, but they're all over the place. The Tamar River Valley, if you go to Tassie, look at it on Google Maps, it's two straight sides with a river in the middle that bounces from side to side. It's a classic. It's the largest rift valley in Australia. The Latrobe Valley is a rift valley, so they're not uncommon and they really impact the landscape. The other thing that we've got in Victoria, and when I talk about this, some people know exactly what I'm talking about and other people go, nah, that can't be true. All that grey area is lava from what's called the new volcanics. In the last 2 million years, finishing about 5,000 years ago, which in geological terms means it probably hasn't finished yet, there was massive volcanic activity. Every one of those dots there in the different colours, red, blue and black, is a volcano. It's incredibly active.
No, that can't be true.
I was waiting for that.
Oh, yes it is.
And you can see, when it comes to Port Phillip, that the lava basically ends at Corio Bay. So in fact, that edge of the bay is pretty much an artefact of the lava flowing over the top of everything and stopping there. Which is, if you're sailing to Geelong, again speaking from experience here, and you're racing in the passage race and you're wanting to maximise your tack to one side or the other, do it to the south, because if you go too far you'll hit sand, because it's either mud or lava if you go to the north side. So that's what's going on there. Now interestingly, the last of those volcanoes is about 5,000 years old, and that's by no means extinct. There's at least three volcanoes in that area in Victoria and South Australia that are still currently classified as active. And they're a type of volcano which interestingly doesn't just sort of rumble around for thousands of years before it explodes. They usually give you about a week's warning. So just be aware of that if you're heading down to Mount Gambier in particular.
Is there anything specific that caused the, like 5,000 years ago that we know of?
That caused it to stop?
Yeah.
I will talk about that later. But yeah, good question. So this is showing you a diagram. So you've got the Port Phillip sunkland, it's called. So the Port Phillip Bay is just basically sunk. It just happened to have a river going through it. Interestingly, Western Port's the same. It's got much more, all those solid lines are fault lines. It's got much more complex faults over there, but it's essentially the same too. It's sunken down. And you can see over in the west side of Port Phillip, there's a range of things happening along Corio Bay that make that bay more complicated, smaller faults along there. So I want to go back in history a bit now. We went back for the volcanoes, but also in terms of sea level. This is I don't know why it turned out fuzzy at one end, but the sea level changes a lot depending on the climate. Now we're at this end of the graph, 0 is current sea level and 150 minus 150 is 150 metres down. Along this side is thousands of years, so we've got 0, 20,000, 40,000 up to 140,000 years. And you can see that 20,000 years ago, this is in Bass Strait, not in Port Phillip, the sea level was 150 metres less than now. And why was that? Because it was the peak of the glacial. All the water was locked up in ice. And at that stage, Port Phillip Bay would have been completely dry. And why is the rip that deep canyon? Because the Yarra would have been coming out and would have got to the edge of the shelf, or in this case into Bass Strait, to drop off into Bass Strait, and just cascaded down a massive waterfall. And at those times, the whole of this area out here would have been dry, a lot of sand. Basically, everything west of here until you get to Western Australia is sand. And so there's been a massive amount of sand for millions of years just coming across with the fundamentally westerly flow. So there's a lot of sand ends up in this part of the world here. And in the dry times that blows around. Now you remember I said at the rip at Point Nepean and Point Lonsdale, there's these aeolianites, these wind-blown sand rocks. You know, what we all know as sandstone. That's where they came from. So in the glacial times, it's very dry. It's freezing, but it's dry, and the wind is blowing. There's a lot of bare sand, and these areas have accreted, become rock, and then caused that sort of basically the southern coast of much of Victoria, and blocking off Port Phillip Bay with the Yarra gradually cutting through when it was flowing in the wetter times. So in the glaciation times, this is a bit of an old diagram. I've got more information now, but I couldn't find a good picture of it. This is what the bay would have looked like. We wouldn't have been going sailing. We might have had a kayak club. You can see it would have been very flat. The Yarra and its tributaries, the Werribee, Little River and so on, they're coming in. And actually what they've found now that they've done more analysis, it would have been much more like interdigitating maze of channels. And that would have been from sometime before 20,000 years ago until about 7,000 or 8,000 years ago when the sea came back in. So what would it have been like? Most of that time it would have been cold, it's deep sands and it's dry. The Yarra probably wasn't flowing very much. Interestingly, the Aboriginal Boonwurrung people here have a legend that this area around here used to be fantastic for hunting kangaroos and a whole range of other things you can only do on dry land, and that there was a sudden event because, as they say in there, and it's not a legend, it's a handed down story, as they say, because we hadn't been managing the land properly, there was a sudden event and it flooded. Well, it probably did, and we'll get to that in a minute. So it would have been basically probably a bit like the northern part of the Prom, or a bit like southwest Tasmania, woodlands, heathlands, swamp areas. Because it was very cold, probably snow gums like you get up in the Alps now. In fact, if you go down to the peninsula now, you can still find occasional snow gums and little frosty hollows there that have survived since then. Low vegetation, lots of swamps, probably very rich in flora and fauna, and a pretty good place to be if you're an Aboriginal person back then. Just on that, I mean, it's a pretty accurate story they passed down. There's been a study done where they looked at 27 places around Australia that were coastal places where geologically you could accurately date major changes in sea level intrusions and changes, and the handed down stories, which were in some cases 7,000 years, in the longest case 22,000 years since that event, were remarkably accurate, where they could verify them against what could be determined to have happened on the ground. So the Yarra's flowing, but it's dry. And what they've recently discovered, this is pretty new research, is around about somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, it couldn't get out to the sea anymore. And probably something dammed it up where that little red line is down there, the rip. Probably drifting sand. Nobody has been able to find anything down there to work out what it is. So the bay would have been essentially dry, and that little Lake Phillip, as they called it, would have been a gradually drying, more and more saline lake. Not much of a place to go sailing again. So we're kind of in a lucky time for sailing. And all that changed when sea level came up a bit, and that whatever was damming it there broke, a la the Aboriginal story. It probably would have come back in very suddenly. In a matter of possibly days, possibly weeks.
So the basin of Port Phillip for a while might have been under sea level, below sea level.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good point. Now that lake almost certainly would have been below sea level. A little bit about, I'm talking about what the past environment was like. So this is where we are now, down here. You can just see indicated on that with a couple of curly lines through the bay where the old course of the Yarra used to go, and in the middle of the picture you can see a northerly sort of inlet going there. The Yarra probably moved between here, the St Kilda Hill, this ridge here, which would have never been able to get past, and the lava on the other side at Williamstown, and the mouth of the Yarra probably just moved across there over hundreds of thousands of years. It's all sandy, all swampy, and it would have been, again, a pretty productive environment for the Aboriginal people. And this is one which is basically showing the same thing, a bit more detail around the close to the Yarra and around Port Melbourne. But I've just put in that little green line there. That's my little discovery. That's Nelson Parade. If you're in South Melbourne, nip up to Nelson Parade. An interesting place. I used to mull over how it could be like this. So it's curved, and on the uphill side, the houses are like every house in the city of Port Phillip. They're at the same level as the street. On the downhill side, there is a drop of several metres to the front of the houses. And what I realised is that's the old shoreline. So if you're thinking about sea level going up, that could have been the last one. There was a high sea level about 4,000 years ago, just a brief one. Or it could have been the much older one of 140 odd thousand years ago. But that's almost certainly what they call a stranded coastline. And that was the frontal dune, and settlers are not silly people. They're going to build the road along the top of the dune, not underneath it, and then it's got subdivided and so on. And that little blue bit you can see just near that's the old mouth of the Yarra, and that now is where the high rise, the HMAS building is, and there's parklands all behind that, because that was an actual inlet that was stranded by the Yarra moving.
So that was the old Port Melbourne, which was infilled.
It wasn't really, that area. It used to be called, there's a Bridge Street there. It was called Bridge Street because it went over a significant inlet, and that's where the first fishing fleets in Melbourne had their harbour. But in the days before sewerage, since there was no actual flow in and out of it really, it became fairly disgusting, and they filled it in. But that's why it was never developed until they did high rise, because it's 300 feet of sand underneath. You've got to afford fairly expensive foundations to make it worth building anything.
I did hear stories about when they were building that RMYS building, that's where the port used to be, and when they were drilling the piles down, they pulled up all sorts of stuff in the old tip, which was all relics from the 18th century.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. There's all sorts of stuff down there. So I just wanted to show this. So this is where we are now, and again, it doesn't really quite capture it, but you can see the Yarra's coming out. It's changed from its old course, which used to loop up to the north because Mr. Coode cut a canal through to make it straighter and easier for the ships. But coming in, it does basically a right angle bend where it hits the lava again. That's that lava stopping things that the Yarra probably went further out pre the volcanics, and you can see up at the top where it says Abbotsford, the Yarra does a right angle bend there too, and that's where it first hits the lava coming down from Warrandyte and so on. So that volcanics came right in, and of course significant framing of Melbourne surrounds. So when all this sea level was going up and down, this is what's happening in Bass Strait. You see at the lowest point, the green is land. The lowest point, Bass Strait is completely dry. There might have been a lake in the middle of that white area, or at least a salt lake or dried out or whatever. It opens up on the western side first, and so you can imagine the Yarra flowing out there. But look what else is flowing into it. The largest river in that area is the Tamar River from Tassie, and it's flowing north through that area and coming around and joining the Yarra. And then you can see when it's almost completely, it is completely inundated on the western side, but not yet on the eastern side. What is actually happening is the Yarra is a tributary of the Tamar River, and if you can see in this picture, I'll see if I can get the cursor, here it is. Here's the rip here, up here. This is the old course of the Yarra, drawn in here. And this is a tributary that goes in through some lower areas, and that's the Tamar River. So the Yarra was a small tributary of the large Tamar River, and that's all happening under you when you sail the King Island. So any Tasmanians here, they really own the Yarra. It's just a little tributary of their river.
So what was the rainfall at that time?
When the lowest sea levels, the rainfall was very low, very low. It would have been higher in Tassie than in Victoria, so it would have been even more a little tributary to a bigger river. Now your question, Nadine, what's going on with the volcanics? There's a concept in volcanic geology called the hotspot, and some of you have probably heard about that, which is basically there are spots which are weaknesses in the Earth's crust where volcanoes will come up, and because the continents are all moving on these big tectonic plates, as a tectonic plate moves over that hotspot, every so often you'll get a volcano, and then that'll finish and the continent will move on, but that volcano will come through again at another time. Now this is, that red line is a line where Australia has been going over a hotspot, and each one of those circles is a volcanic location, except for the bottom one. So all the other ones on the mainland, they're all hotspot volcanoes. Now it's thought that that big western lava flow in Victoria was a very large outbreak of a hotspot, but they're not quite sure on that. That's really the theory. There's a whole lot of other hotspots off to the east. If you look on Google Earth, you see these lines of seamounts. The classic hotspot is the Hawaiian chain, where they're currently the main island is very active and it's the current hotspot. So in this case, Australia's moving north about 14 centimetres a year, quite fast, fastest moving continent in the world at the moment. And if there was another eruption right now, the hotspot is thought to be just about on northwest Tassie. And interestingly, there is another area which they think may well be a hotspot that's just on northeast Tassie. There's a lot of, the largest earthquakes in southeastern Australia are all just off northeast Tassie. So again, there could be something interesting happening. So if you're cruising Bass Strait, just think about that when you're anchoring. If the sea starts to bubble, just move along. Now, getting back, so that's sort of the broad view. Getting back into what happens in Port Phillip Bay. This shows the patterns of what's called longshore drift. Longshore drift is how the sand moves along the beaches, and it actually is an abbreviation of along shore. I always used to believe it's to do with the length of the shore, but it's just along the shore drift. And if you look at this, you can see there's a couple of wind roses there. The wind roses show you the direction that the wind is coming from. So if the arrow's pointing north, it means the wind is blowing from the north. And the longer the arrow, the more wind is coming from that direction. And so the bottom one is the winter one, where the northerly winds are predominant on Port Phillip Bay. And the top one is the summer one, where south and southwesterly winds due to the sea breeze are predominant. And what that means is in the north-south parts of the bay, you can see on the arrows pointing in both directions along that coast, you get different movement of sand winter and summer. Less so in Corio Bay and close to the Rip because currents are taking over, and also in Corio Bay so sheltered that the wind operates quite differently there. And this is just illustrating that. So this is a couple of diagrams done from aerial photos at Black Rock Beach, and you can see in the in April, which is the first one on this side, the dominant drift is from the south, and the sand is all up that end of the beach. In May to October, it's down the other end of the beach. And this is a classic problem for people that work on beach renourishment, because you get councils rushing in or residents rushing in saying, my beach is disappearing, you have to put it back. And they say, well, wait 6 months and it'll come back. And that never wins you any vote, but it might just be the truth. One of the impacts of this is what happens if you put a breakwater out there. So this is Brighton. And on the top it says January 1951. So there's a pier at Brighton, but there's no breakwater. And you can see it's just a normal, narrow beach. Then they built the breakwater in 1954, and then an aerial photo in 1961. You can see a bit of a triangular bulge starting to happen. And what you can see right through up to 1998 is that bulge keeps basically getting bigger and is pretty stable. And currently that bulge is very large and is impeding access to their marina. Now, why does this happen? It happens because a breakwater works like a diffraction grid. So and this is actually not a really great diagram. What it should show is the waves coming into the breakwater from due west, but then when they hit the breakwater on the north side, they angle around, they diffract and come that way. But on the south side, they go the other way, and it pushes the sand into this triangle. So you get that at every marina in Port Phillip Bay, and probably in the world, that has a breakwater that is open on both sides. So this is Sandringham. This is one where it's closed on one side, but nonetheless you can see that this is from 1881, where it was just a rocky shelf, there was no marina and so on. There's a bit of sand build up on the obvious side because it can't get around. But you can see the sand build up is much, much greater once that breakwater is in. And you're also getting an impacted sand where the sand is building up at the end of the breakwater, making it very shallow from similar diffraction effects. This is us, exactly, triangle out there. But love it or not, and personally I love it, the walk out there, we've got a long pier. And that means that triangular area of sand will never get out far enough to impact on the use of our marina. Essentially it's pretty stable where it is. Whereas Brighton are looking at several $100,000 worth of dredging every 2 to 3 years. And it's just fundamental physics. There's nothing they can do to turn it off. It's just going to happen. And Sandy is going to have constant silting up at the end of its jetty. But just to show that it's a real thing wherever you go, this is St Leonard's. St Leonard's is a bit different because there's only really one direction of longshore drift. So you're getting a kind of one-directional triangle. You can see that little bulge there that's pointing the way the longshore drift goes. Here at Blairgowrie, that's a fairly new marina, and what you can see is the start. You can see a little bump here with the diffraction of the waves coming around that side, and a little bump here, and over time they're going to turn into the triangle out there, and people wanting to launch off their hard stand there might, find it's getting a bit shallow, though they are a reasonable way out with some fairly strong currents, so they might be okay. So that's just a sort of bit of background about what's going on in our bays and so on. And I did say I'd make a few comments about what this means for your sailing. I really only said that to get people to come along. There probably are a couple of things. As I said, there are different substrates in our bay, and you should be aware of them if you're cruising and you want to anchor. There are certainly significant differences, and most of the experienced bay sailors will know this, but those that mainly race up here may not, between the Northern Bay and the Great Sands area, which is very dominated by tide. The tides are higher, they're stronger, and you really have to think quite differently to sail down there. If you do go to a regatta in Blairgowrie, you want somebody on board who's a local, because if you don't get your head around the currents and the tides, you'll struggle, whereas up here you've got to be a pretty damn top sailor before the tidal influence is enough to be worth considering. Obviously the big differences between here and Western Port, and I say to anyone who's thinking of going overseas and sailing in highly tidal areas, because you get no experience of that in Port Phillip, just go and spend a week or two in Western Port. I think Western Port's a fantastic cruising destination. You can easily spend a month there. Get your boat in the marina over there if you can, and sail on the weekends in winter. It's a great place to do it. But your whole life is you really learn about tides and depths and currents in Western Port, and it's a useful skill because a lot of the world is like that. And the final thing I'd just like to mention is with the Great Sands down the bottom, obviously we've got the ship channel, which is the old Yarra main channel that was natural, which has been dredged out. We've got West Channel on there. That's pretty much the places we all go. But there's a whole bunch of other channels there, and at least 2 of them well 3 of them really are navigable unless you've got an extreme depth issue, and are well worth trying. Sometimes they're a lot shorter, and sometimes they're just a bit of fun navigation to get away, because they don't have a lot of marks in them, like 0 normally. But there's certainly options for getting out and exploring those areas, and if you use the Navionics web app and so on with really detailed contours, it's pretty safe to do these days. And there's some interesting places to go out there, like South Channel Fort, with it's got a little jetty there. Again, if you're not don't have problems with depth, but you want to think about the current. If you try to get into that jetty and there's a 4-knot current ripping past it, it's quite different to getting there on slack water. So yeah, that's it. I'm happy to take any questions, but there you go.
The Yarra joins the Tamar River. So is there
out in Bass Strait.
No, say in the bay, do we
Oh,
still
yeah.
have
Yeah,
particular
no, you-
currents that still stronger where the river used to run?
No, not really. What happened is where the river had a significant channel that was still detectable, the port authorities thought that's good. We'll dredge that, thanks very much, and it's turned into the shipping channel. So yes, there is a current down the shipping channel where that's dredged, but in the middle of the bay where there's no dredging done, those multiple channels that were there once are largely filled with silt. You can't really detect them with your echo sounder. The way they detected them was using a technology that shoots sound waves that actually go through the surface and come back off the bedrock. And you can see them quite clearly. I did have a picture. I thought about putting that in, but I didn't do it. But you can see they were, quite significant, obvious channels, but they're not there now. They've been largely filled in with silt and sand.
Charles, now the current's been raised, I thought the one heading to speaking about current, the thing that intrigues me about Port Phillip is you sort of think about tides coming in and out, but they don't actually do that. The current actually runs clockwise around the bay, and that's due to sort of a rather arcane effect of tidal movement and the Coriolis effect. So although the currents aren't very strong, there is actually a continual, doesn't matter whether the tide's going in or out, it's always rotating.
Yeah, you're right. There's a very slow gyre just going around anti-clockwise. I didn't know that was why the Coriolis, but it makes
Well,
sense.
it's a combination.
Yeah. So
But the other interesting thing about it, of course, everybody in the east thinks it's this terrible rotten place over the west, but the Yarra goes out positive, and it's actually the other way around. The Yarra comes out and goes down the east.
the Yarra comes down. I mean, most of the Yarra silt drops out for us. It doesn't really get much further than here, and then it's sort of it's dropped out. But the Yarra water,
Well, yeah, I mean, but the current is actually coming that way, not the other way.
yeah. But if you get a flood in the Yarra, it'll reverse.
Not relating to Port Phillip, hotspot. When was to your knowledge, when was the last volcanic activity in Victoria? That's disputed, isn't it?
Yeah, look, in that whole area, it's very clear that Mount Gambier and Mount Shank, which are both in South Australia and both close to